A person truly begins to live when he learns to study alone. No teacher, no money, no applause. In a world where everything appears shiny and packaged into quick learning bundles, success calls. Have you ever wondered what learning is, if not the way we quietly rebuild ourselves from fragmented pieces? Is it possible to self-study without loneliness? Or is self-study the art of living amidst loneliness without breaking? This book doesn't offer instruction, but an invitation. It doesn't place you in the position of someone who needs to be taught, but invites you to become someone who reflects. I will tell you in the first person, not because I am the protagonist, but because I want to take responsibility for every experience recounted. I will not hide behind neutral structures or cold arguments. This is the voice of a human full of doubts, full of a desire to understand, and learning how to stand tall in this chaotic world. So, if you're still grappling with the questions of what to learn, how to learn, and why, then perhaps the journey I am about to tell will not provide answers. But it might help you reframe those questions in a way that makes you no longer rush to find immediate solutions. And now, I shall begin this book. Chapter 1, Seeking a Definition. Many years ago, when I was a young man with nothing but a few old books and a vague belief in knowledge, I used to ask myself, what kind of person is truly educated? Not a textbook question, but a genuine frustration amidst a society full of people who bore the title of intellectual. Some commanded my respect, while others made me wary. What constitutes true learning, and what is merely a facade? I once met a doctor, his head filled with theories, his drawers overflowing with papers, who couldn't even change a burnt-out light bulb in his own home. He spoke endlessly about ethics, but all I heard was a jumble of complicated concepts, incapable of stirring even a blade of grass. Then there was another person, without any formal qualifications, whose single sentence made my heart pound. Not because of their voice or words, but because that sentence came from lived experience, from a wisdom purified by sweat and tears. And so, I began my journey to find a definition for the words learning and scholarship. I saw many people mistakenly believe that learning is accumulation. The more knowledge one gathers, the more books one remembers, the more things one knows, the more educated one is. But that is a trap. I call it parrot learning. A parrot can repeat sounds but doesn't understand their meaning, just as a person who learns this way only repeats the words of teachers, books, and others, without ever truly living with what they know. Learning without digestion is like chewing without swallowing. Grass that doesn't turn into smooth fur is still just grass. Leaves that don't transform into silk are still just leaves. I realized that knowledge is only valuable when it is transformed into action, into independent thought, into profound insight about life. And to achieve that, the learner must live slowly, must dare to confront the emptiness within themselves. There was a time I studied for an exam to the point of despair. I forgot everything I had learned, couldn't remember a single concept. I ran to my father to complain. He didn't blame or scold me. He simply said, "Forgetting means you've truly tasted it." That phrase has stayed with me my whole life because it was true. Afterward, in the exam room, my answers came naturally. Knowledge flowed out like water from a deep well, not forced by memory, but absorbed into my very being. Because of this, I gradually understood that a truly educated person is not someone who displays wisdom through words, but someone who radiates understanding through their way of life, their observations, and their ability to be silent when necessary. There are people who don't speak much, but a single glance, a single question, is enough to make the other person pause and think, because they don't need to prove anything. They live in understanding, not to show that they understand. Throughout my journey of self-learning, I met many people who learned for different purposes. Some learned to secure a profession. There's nothing wrong with that, everyone needs to live. But some learned simply for the sake of learning, because they couldn't live without learning. These are the people I respect the most. They are not driven by self-interest, nor controlled by material goals. They learn as a way of breathing. Without it, they feel dead. I'm not romanticizing anything. I too once learned because I wanted social recognition, wanted a title to feel confident. But then I saw that such titles can easily mislead people. Outsiders see us as smart, and we begin to believe we truly are smart. And so, we stop learning. That is the tragedy of many paper intellectuals, brilliant on paper but intellectually impoverished. Some say genius is being born special, but I don't believe that. I read about Darwin, Spinoza, Pascal, people who were physically weak, whose memory was no better than anyone else's, even easily distracted. But they were patient. They took slow, relentless steps, and it was those drops of effort that created genius. For me, genius is not the explosion of innate talent, but the result of a life full of struggle, full of perseverance. It's when you can sit for hours just pondering a small problem. Not for praise, not for money, but because you cannot not understand it. Because if you don't understand, you feel incomplete. I once sat for hours just rereading a passage, rewriting an idea again and again until it felt true to my heart. I once spent sleepless nights, not for work, but because a question in my head refused to rest. And I knew that was when I was truly learning, not for grades, not for fame, but because I needed it to continue being human. Learning, ultimately, is a process of becoming human, not to be better than others, but to be truer to oneself. For a long time, I lived with a sense of emptiness. Not because I lacked knowledge, but because I realized I was only repeating what others had said. I read books, I listened to lectures, I took notes, I did assignments. But then I felt it was all just a layer of clothing I wore, not my true skin. I felt like someone wearing many layers of clothes, hot in the sun, wet in the rain, without knowing who I truly was inside. It was in that moment that I understood. Learning without understanding oneself is merely superficial adornment. Learning that doesn't reflect into life is just an illusion. An educated person isn't necessarily superior to others in the quantity of knowledge, but rather in knowing what they don't yet know and daring to live with that imperfection without hiding it. I began to reorganize my way of learning. I didn't learn to memorize, I learned to question. I learned to doubt the very things I once believed with certainty. Once, I reread a philosophy book I had memorized in the past. I thought I understood it. But when I reread it through the eyes of someone who had experienced failure and loss, I realized I hadn't understood anything at all. What I once considered truth suddenly felt empty, and things I had merely skimmed over now cut me like a knife. I realized that knowledge only becomes truly ours when it passes through emotion, through pain, through struggle. Knowledge must be tested by life to truly take root. A good student is not necessarily someone who lives deeply, but someone who lives deeply, even if they study little, can understand things that books do not convey. I met an old carpenter once while volunteering in the countryside. He couldn't read, but the way he measured each plank, carved each curve, amazed me. He told me something I remember to this day. If you want the wood to follow your hand must first follow the nature of the wood. That sentence, if written in a book, could be a grand theorem on adaptability and understanding others. But he didn't need theory. He lived that truth every day. From then on, I stopped underestimating what wasn't in books. I learned from street vendors, from drivers, from a child asking why the sky is blue. Each person is an open book, and the important thing is whether we are quiet enough to read them. I also developed a habit. When I read something profound, I don't immediately take notes. I let it live in my head for a few days. I carry it through everyday situations. I try to see where it holds true, where it falls short, and when it feels out of tune. Only when I see it still alive after this trial period do I consider it truly mine. Thus, I no longer believe in cramming. I believe in gradual absorption. Learning is like pouring water onto a stone slowly, but each drop shapes perception. Learning is not about adding more, but about filtering out the superfluous. Learning is not to be filled, but to be illuminated. Someone asked me, if you had to choose between someone who learns little but lives genuinely and someone who learns a lot but lives falsely, whom would you choose? I said, I choose the third person, someone who learns little but continues to learn and lives honestly with their incompleteness. Because that is the person I can trust and learn alongside. I don't offer a rigid definition for learning because I understand that definitions are just frameworks, while a person is a process. An educated person is someone who constantly redefines their understanding of themselves. And that is the journey. I am on a journey without road signs, without a fixed destination, but where every step is meaningful. Chapter 2, Key Elements. I once thought that with enough passion and determination, I could self-learn anything. But the truth is not that simple. There were days I read hundreds of pages but couldn't remember a single idea. There were times I eagerly started learning a new topic, only to get bored and give up a few days later. I began to ask why some people succeed wonderfully at self-learning while I kept going in circles. That's when I realized self-learning isn't just an act of studying, it's an art of living. It demands many internal qualities, seemingly minor ones, yet they determine the sustainability of the entire process. I sat down, looked back at myself, and gradually recognized the core elements that forge the strength of a self-learner. The first and most important is willpower. For me, willpower isn't stubbornness or zealous determination. It's a quiet inner strength, like an underground stream, not loud, not showy, but when needed, it surfaces and becomes a spring, a river. A truly resolute person is someone who can study in solitude. No one praises them, no one pushes them, no reward is needed. They learn because they feel they cannot not learn. There are days I feel hollow inside, not wanting to do anything, but I still open a book. Not because I'm great, but because I know if I skip today, I'll easily skip the whole next month. Anyone can learn when inspired, but only those with willpower can continue when tired and disheartened. The second element I recognized is faith. It might sound abstract, but I've seen with my own eyes very intelligent people unable to learn anything simply because they constantly doubted themselves. They read books but didn't believe they understood. They listened to lectures but always thought others were smarter than them. They wrote down an idea only to cross it out, fearing it was silly. I used to be like that. I was afraid of writing wrong, afraid of misunderstanding, afraid of others laughing at me. It was much later that I realized learning isn't about proving you're smart, but about becoming a little less ignorant each day. And that requires very strong faith. Faith that even if you don't understand today, with persistence, you will understand one day. The third element, passion. Passion doesn't come from finding what you're good at, but from diving deep enough into something to lose track of time. I once read about scientists, artists, philosophers. They didn't succeed because of innate talent. They succeeded because they were so engrossed that they couldn't live if they weren't doing that work. I once spent an entire night just rereading a passage from a sacred text, not for an exam, not because anyone asked, but because there was something in that passage that touched the deepest part of me. At that moment, I was no longer a learner. I was someone living in learning. Someone asked me, "How do you cultivate passion?" I don't have a definitive answer, but I know that if you never sit long enough with a problem, you will never see its beauty. It's like someone standing outside a garden complaining that the flowers aren't fragrant. You have to bend down, touch the soil, let the scent permeate your hands to truly understand. The fourth element is imagination. A good learner is someone who can make connections. When they read a sentence, they don't just understand the sentence itself, but also see the context, the underlying emotions, the metaphors. They don't learn like chewing a stone, but like sipping a cup of tea. Each layer of flavor is a layer of meaning. I call this academic imagination. Learning without imagination is like living in a house with hundreds of windows but never opening any. You might think you see, but if you open a window and connect it to a real-life situation, a character, a memory, then knowledge floods in and becomes vibrant. Once, I read a 6-word poem by Nguyen Du and wept. Not because the words were mournful, but because I suddenly remembered my mother's gaze when she saw me off to study, a gaze filled with hope, fear, trust, and helplessness. Those 6 words awakened an entire realm of memories, and from that day, I could never forget the lesson of that day. There's another element, very quiet but crucial in the self-learning journey, discipline. I'm not talking about rigid, military-style discipline, but a softer kind. Discipline that comes from self-respect. When I was young, I used to think I'd study when I felt like it, and not when I didn't. But then I realized that if I waited for inspiration to strike, I would never start in my entire life. Inspiration is a fickle guest. It doesn't come on command. Discipline, however, is the host, always there, ready to open the door every morning. I once experimented with myself. I set a fixed time each day for reading. No matter what happened, no social media, no phone, no street tea, just me and the book. It was very difficult at first, but after a few weeks, I saw myself change. I no longer waited for inspiration. I studied because it was time to study, And strangely, it was from that discipline that inspiration began to appear, regularly and kindly, like an old friend. Another element I cannot fail to mention: humility asterisk asterisk. There's a truth that few speak of: the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know. Shallow people always think they're right. Experienced people are often reserved. True learning doesn't make you arrogant, it makes you more contemplative, because you see that knowledge isn't for winning arguments against others, but for understanding yourself more deeply. I used to get angry easily when someone contradicted me. I used to strain to defend what I believed was right. But the more I read, the more I lived, the more I saw how many times I had been wrong. And then I learned to listen. I learned to say, "I'm not sure if I'm right," and realized that didn't diminish me. On the contrary, it made me much more comfortable. Self-learning also requires something else that many overlook: intuition asterisk. There are things you read once and immediately feel they are true, they resonate. There are things that, even if logical, still feel somehow wrong. Intuition is not mere emotion, it is the culmination of life experience, subtle perception of what you have seen, suffered, enjoyed. I once ignored my intuition to follow the words of others, and I paid the price. Since then, I've learned to listen to that inner voice, a voice that is not loud but always honest. Finally, I want to talk about an element everyone possesses but few cultivate sufficiently: patience asterisk asterisk. Self-learning doesn't yield immediate results. It's not like buying an item or eating a hot bowl of pho. It's like planting a seed, then watering it, weeding it every day, and waiting. There are sunny days, rainy days, days when it seems the seed has died. But if you don't give up, one day you will see a tiny, fragile green shoot emerge. But that is the beginning of a tree that can provide shade for a lifetime. I have wanted to give up many times. I have torn up notebooks, slammed tables, sworn I would never study again. But then I always returned, picking up the shattered fragments of the belief I had broken. Because I know that if I don't continue to learn, I will just be a talking corpse. Learning, for me, is the only way to live meaningfully. And it is from these elements: willpower, faith, passion, imagination, discipline, humility, intuition, patience, that I gradually become someone who can be called learning, not finished learning. Because I am never finished learning. When you begin to self-learn, you know you are not alone. You are walking a path that many have trodden, bumpy, obscure, but also full of blooming flowers and light. And if you are persistent enough, you will meet yourself, a better, deeper, more vibrant version. Asterisk Chapter 3. Favorable conditions for self-study asterisk. There's one thing very few people tell you honestly. Self-learning is a beautiful but thorny path, not because knowledge is difficult, but because our surrounding environment doesn't always support it. I once had to study under the worst conditions: noise, lack of books, no one understanding what I was doing. And it was in those circumstances that I truly understood what constitutes favorable conditions for self-study. Many think that as long as you have determination, you can learn anywhere, anytime. That's partly true. Determination is like the engine. But for a car to travel far, you need fuel, roads, and good wheels. Self-learning is similar. It needs an environment, space, time, and even a suitable temperament. The first condition I want to talk about is asterisk asterisk quietude asterisk asterisk. Not absolute physical silence, but a space quiet enough that you are not pulled out of your train of thought every 10 minutes. I once studied in cramped rooms where the sound of cars outside screamed through every crack in the door. Some days I had to retreat to a storage room to read. It wasn't beautiful, but it was quiet enough for me to listen to myself. Quietude also means quietude of the mind. You can sit alone, but if your head is full of the voices of social media, of judgments, of worries about money or relationships, you cannot learn anything. I once opened a book but kept rereading the same line, not because I didn't understand, but because my mind was preoccupied with an unanswered text message. So I learned to declutter. Not just tidying my desk, but also decluttering internally. Each time I studied, I turned off all notifications. I wrote down my worries on a piece of paper so they wouldn't float around in my brain anymore. And I promised myself, this hour is for learning, everything else can wait. The second condition is a asterisk asterisk personal space asterisk asterisk. It doesn't need to be luxurious, just yours. A small corner of a desk, a familiar chair, a lamp providing enough light, a place where you can sit down and your brain immediately recognizes, ah, it's time to learn. This space should have familiarity, your marks in old notebook. A photograph, a scent you like so you feel safe and don't have to adapt each time you begin. Someone asked me, "Can I study at a coffee shop?" I said, "Yes, if you choose the right one. A quiet enough place, no acquaintances, no Wi-Fi so you don't get distracted watching videos." I once had such a regular spot. Stone tables, wooden chairs, no air conditioning, natural light, and instrumental music. I wrote the most pages there. The third condition, suitable time asterisk. Not everyone learns well in the morning. I am the opposite. Mornings are when my mind is clearest, lightest. I often wake early, when the city is still misty, and sit at my desk before the sun is fully up. At that time, I feel everything within me is fresh, like a blank page. But I also know some people learn very well at night when everything is quiet. The important thing is for you to find your own golden hour, the time when your brain operates most effectively. Observe yourself for a few weeks. Try studying at different times, and you will realize when you truly get into the rhythm. Another condition rarely mentioned is *** physical condition ***. You cannot learn if you're tired, hungry, have a headache, or are sleepy. I once forced myself to study when my body was overwhelmed, and the result was nothing but frustration. The body is the foundation of the mind. If you take good care of it, eating regularly, exercising moderately, getting enough sleep, learning will become much easier. I don't pursue an ascetic lifestyle. I believe learning is part of living, and living must be healthy. I don't hesitate to take a nap or go for a walk when my mind feels blocked. Once, I skipped an entire study session to go hiking, and when I came down from the mountain, I wrote 10 pages straight, because my mind was refreshed. Furthermore, there's a condition that seems secondary, but is key for a self-learner. You need a *** clear goal ***. It doesn't have to be a grand ambition like becoming a great scholar or writing a timeless book, but simply an honest enough reason to sit down every day and turn the next page. I once studied without knowing why. Just because I saw others studying, I studied too. As a result, I was caught in a spiral, learning out of fear of falling behind, learning to prove I wasn't inferior. But then one day, I saw an old paragraph I had written. Awkward yet sincere, it made my heart ache. And at that moment, I knew I was learning to rewrite, to write more accurately, more deeply, more genuinely. From then on, every book I read, every piece of knowledge I acquired became meaningful. A goal helps you choose. When you know what you're learning for, you won't be confused by distractions. You won't rush into courses just because you see others taking them. You will learn selectively. What helps you get closer to your goal, keep. What distracts you, put aside. Besides goals, I want to emphasize another element, timely companionship ***. Self-learning doesn't mean studying alone forever. Sometimes you need others to illuminate, to ask questions, to challenge your thinking. There were things I read repeatedly and couldn't understand, but just by having a friend ask me in a different way, I suddenly saw the light. Not because they were smarter than me, but because their perspective helped me open a door in my mind. I once had a small study group, 3 of us. We met once a week, each bringing an idea, a book, or even an unanswered question. Those meetings had no curriculum, no teacher, only dialogue. But it was thanks to those conversations that I discovered many things I wouldn't have seen if I had just sat alone. Another condition for self-learning, seemingly simple but essential, a system for retention ***. I don't believe in learning without taking notes. Human memory is very fickle. There are things we find extremely insightful today, but just a few days later, they fade like smoke. I always carry a small notebook or at least my phone with a note-taking app. Whenever I have a good idea, a memorable quote, a special image, I record it immediately. But not just recording. Each week I spend time rereading what I've written. I connect ideas. I rewrite them in my own understanding. Once, from a single note about a small matter, I wrote a 4-page essay. Because when I returned to it with a changed mind, it blossomed like a seed meeting water. And finally, the most essential but also most fragile condition, keeping the flame alive ***. Self-learning is like nurturing a small fire. Some days the wind is strong, you have to shield it carefully. Some rainy days, you have to patiently dry each piece of kindling. The fire doesn't always blaze, but if you don't let it die out, one day it will be big enough to warm your entire life. I have had days when I lost the fire, days when everything seemed meaningless, when books were just piles of paper, when my mind was as empty as an abandoned room. On those days, I didn't force myself to study. I just did one thing, kept the embers glowing with an old song, an old movie, an old book I once loved. To remember why I started. You don't need to be a brilliant student, you don't need to be smart. You just need to know that learning is a way to live more honestly with yourself. And if you hold on to that, all other conditions, space, time, method will gradually find you. I have learned during years full of insecurity, amidst the chaotic movements of life. But it is precisely because of this that I firmly believe anyone can self-learn if they know how to create, protect, and cultivate these favorable conditions for learning. Perfect conditions are not needed, just conditions that are true enough, and you are true enough to them. Chapter 4, Essential Tools. Throughout my self-learning journey, I once thought the most important thing was willpower. Then I thought perhaps it was the environment, time, or mood. But the deeper I delved, the more I understood that willpower can be strong, the environment can be ideal, but if you don't have the right learning tools, everything is just an arrow without a bow, fire without kindling. This chapter, I want to talk about the essential tools, the instruments that make learning sharp, persistent, and especially effective. I'm not talking about textbooks, libraries, or computers. I'm talking about things that are very familiar yet often overlooked. And if you know how to use them correctly, they will be the most potent weapons in your lifelong quest for knowledge. The first tool, and for me the foundation, is the *** dictionary ***. Sounds too simple, doesn't it? But I once learned like an illiterate person because I was reluctant to look up words. I skimmed, guessed meanings, and told myself I generally understood. And it was that general understanding that killed precision, and with it, the depth of knowledge. Only when I disciplined myself to pause and look up each word carefully did I feel like I was peeling back layers of soil to see the roots of a tree. Each time I looked up a word, I recorded not just the meaning, but also example sentences, the word's origin, and its usage. A single word can carry an entire culture, a layer of meaning hidden beneath the surface. The more I looked up words, the more I saw that language is not a secondary tool, but the very bloodstream that nourishes intelligence. I have an old dictionary, its spine frayed, pages yellowed, but each page within it is a fragment of a map guiding me to territories in my mind I had never traversed. Once I looked up the word Tao, Tao/path/morality, thinking it was too familiar, but the more I read, the more I saw it open up an entire world. Tao as a path, as a principle, as truth. Just one word, and it took me nearly 3 days to absorb it. The second tool, paper and pen ***. In this era, people type more than they write by hand. I did too, but I discovered something strange. What I typed often quickly disappeared from my mind. But what I wrote by hand, however messy and slow, stayed for a very long time. Writing is a form of digesting knowledge through muscle. It's not just recording, it's engraving onto the body. I have a habit of keeping notebooks, each type of notebook for a different purpose. One for jotting down ideas, one for copying beautiful passages, one specifically for critiquing what I read. I don't copy verbatim. I rewrite in my own words, questioning, rebutting, agreeing, adding. Writing is a form of dialogue, and the more I write, the more I realize what I truly understand and what I only think I understand. The third tool, books ***, but not all books are the same. I used to read a lot, and the more I read, the more confused I became. Then I realized that reading widely is not as good as reading deeply. I began to live with one book instead of skimming many. There are books I reread 4 times in a year, each time a new experience, because each reading found me in a different state, a different level of awareness. Choosing books is like choosing companions. Some are only suited for a single meeting. Some should be encountered for life. I don't read books because they are famous, but because I need them at the right moment. Some books arrive like a teacher, teaching me what I didn't know. Some come like a quiet friend, comforting me, and some are mirrors that allow me to see myself within them. The fourth tool, mind maps * or any form of systematization that suits you. I learned many disparate things and sometimes felt they had no connection to each other. But then I practiced connecting them, drawing diagrams, creating idea maps, linking concepts into logical chains. I didn't learn like picking up pebbles, but like laying bricks for a construction. Each brick must have its place, its connection. From then on, I saw learning as a living architecture, not a mere storehouse of information. One of the indispensable tools for me, yet few consider it a learning instrument, is vivid memory ***. I don't have a superhuman memory. I can't remember long strings of numbers, nor can I effortlessly recall names and dates like students cramming for exams. But I train myself in a different kind of memory. Memory connected to images, to emotions, to stories. I remember a theorem not by repetition, but because I visualize it as a universe in operation. I remember a philosophical concept not because I forced myself, but because I once used it to explain a tangled emotion within my heart. You might call it personalized memory. Every piece of knowledge I learn, I connect it to a life scene, a character, an experience. I remember the story of Socrates not because a book recounted it, but because I imagine him as a teacher walking the streets, conversing with conflicted people like those I meet every day. You don't need to remember everything, but you need to remember what is meaningful to you. And to do that, you must allow knowledge to permeate your most vulnerable places where you are true, where you have suffered, loved, been disappointed, hoped. That is where knowledge becomes truly yours. Another tool I've cultivated for a long time is the *** habit of questioning ***. Every book, every conversation, every film, everything I hear in life, I try to ask a question afterward. Why is this true? What if it were in a different context? Did the author intend to say anything else? I write these questions down on paper and sometimes revisit them after weeks or months to see if I now have an answer. I don't ask questions to prove I'm smart. I ask because I genuinely don't understand yet. And the strange thing is, when I am honest with that lack of understanding, a new world opens up. Things I once considered obvious suddenly become strange, inviting, full of hidden meaning. I call this methodical doubt not to destroy, but to illuminate, to strip away the hollow and find the truth hidden beneath a polished exterior. Alongside this, I also use a silent but extremely effective tool: silence and observation ***. In an age where everyone is rushing to express themselves, sitting in silence and observing how things operate becomes a rare skill. I learned the most not in classrooms, but while sitting in a park, listening to a conversation between two strangers, or standing in an old bookstore, noticing how an old man turned each page with trembling fingers. Observation is a source of knowledge that no textbook can teach. It teaches us about people, the most complex and contradictory subject you will spend a lifetime learning. A glance, a frown, a silence between two sentences, all are data, all are lessons unfolding, if you know how to listen. Finally, I want to mention perhaps the most profound tool: gratitude ***. When you learn with an attitude of gratitude to the author, to the book, to the teacher, even to those who have disagreed with you, you open your heart much more. You no longer learn to win, to surpass, to dominate. You learn because you feel lucky to have access to the beautiful and profound insights of humanity. I once sat reading a philosophy book, and tears fell from my eyes, not because of the content of the book, but because I thought, why am I alive in an era where these ideas can reach me, in my own mother tongue? In that moment, I knew it wasn't knowledge that made me grow, but precisely the gratitude for that knowledge. The journey of self-learning, ultimately, is not a conquest of intellectual peaks, but a journey back to oneself, a clearer, calmer, and truer version. And to walk that path, you will need not only determination, not only willpower, but the right tools, the right books, the right habits, and the right attitude to life. These are the things I carry not just to learn, but to live. Chapter 5, What to Read ***. There was a time when I plunged into reading everything I could find. New books, old books, famous books, forgotten books. I didn't discriminate, didn't filter. I read like someone parched in a desert, gulping down every word I saw. But the more I read, the more confused I became. My mind was like a room cluttered with possessions, containing both precious art and junk, and I had no way out. That's when I asked myself, what should I read? It turns out that what to read is even more important than whether * to read. Because you have only one life, and if you're not careful, you'll waste your youth on things that only make your mind noisier. At first, I read out of curiosity. Then I read out of fear of falling behind, fear of not knowing anything, fear of being called outdated. But then I realized that reading like that was reading out of insecurity, not out of a genuine desire for understanding. It made me devour information but digest nothing. My mind at that time was like a storage device, not a generative engine. I started to go back, filter, and reorganize. I set a rule for myself: don't read anything I can't remember after 3 days. If a passage, a book, leaves nothing profound within me, not even an image, an emotion, a question, then perhaps I don't need it right now. I divided books into 3 categories. 1. Books for living, *, these are books that help me solve practical problems. How to manage time, live minimally, eat healthily, understand myself. This type of book is usually easy to read, has a clear structure, and if applied correctly, yields immediate results. But it has a limit. If you read without acting, it's like reading an instruction manual, but never assembling the machine. 2. Books for understanding, *, these are books that open up knowledge: philosophy, history, science, religion. These are books I read not to find solutions, but to broaden my perspective. I read history to know where I stand in the flow of humanity. I read science to feel both small and full of potential. I read philosophy to learn how to ask questions instead of just seeking answers. Reading these books isn't easy. Some pages I have to read 5, 10 times. Some passages I skipped and only revisited a year later to find them suddenly illuminated. This type of book doesn't pat you on the back or give you quick advice. They are lengthy conversations between you and a distant but deeply human intellect. 3. Books for feeling. These are books that touch the tender parts of me: literature, poetry, memoirs, short stories. I read these not to learn anything specific, but to slow down, to be reminded that humans are not just reason, but also emotion, desire, and unnamed wounds. Such books help me retain my humanity in an age that easily turns people into talking machines, capable of giving correct answers but no longer knowing how to ache. Someone asked me whether to read physical books or ebooks. I don't have a universal answer. Personally, I love the feeling of turning pages, the smell of old paper, the ability to write thoughts directly in the margins. But I also read many ebooks: convenient, easy to search, easy to carry. The important thing isn't the format, but whether you truly live with that book. I have a small habit. Whenever I read a passage that makes my heart beat faster, I stop. I don't continue turning the page. I close my eyes, sit still for a few minutes. I let the words sink in. I repeat them in my head. I rewrite them in my own language. I don't read to conquer the number of pages, but to touch something true. There are books where I can only read a few pages a day, not because I'm slow, but because each page opens up a world so vast, so multi-layered, that I cannot rush. These are books that cannot be devoured, like a strong wine that must be sipped, savored for a long time, allowing its essence to permeate the blood. Once, I read the Analects for 3 months and only reached halfway through. Not because the words were difficult, but because I kept stopping at one sentence. Ngo en hat tam tin ngo then. I reflect on myself 3 times a day. I pondered those daily self-examinations and realized that a lifetime could be transformed by just that. People often ask each other how many books they've read in a year, but I ask myself, did any of them change how you live? If not, that number means nothing but speed and empty pride. I learned another thing: some books should not be read too early. I once tried reading Kierkegaard as a student fresh out of high school, and I understood nothing. I found him verbose, vague, illogical. But years later, after experiencing several periods of disorientation in life, I returned to him, and every word felt as if it were written for me at that moment. Some knowledge cannot be force-fed. It can only be invited, and only when you are ripe enough do they quietly enter. So, I learned to choose books like choosing a teacher. Some teachers should be met early to guide you, some should be met late to help you unlock deeper understanding. And some teachers are companions who teach nothing, only walk with you in silence so you can understand yourself. Books are the same. There are also books that should be abandoned. I no longer feel guilty about giving up on a book halfway through. If after 50 pages it gives me nothing but fatigue and a feeling of coercion, I set it aside. Not because the book is bad, but perhaps because I don't need it right now. Reading is not a moral obligation. It is an encounter. If the two sides don't connect, parting ways amicably is the right thing to do. What to read also depends on the stage of life. There was a time I read a lot of philosophy to search for meaning. There was a time I only read poetry to soothe my heart. There was a time I immersed myself in history books to understand I wasn't the first to struggle with life. And there was a time I read nothing at all, just reflected on what I had read, written, and believed. Some books you must read alone. Some should be read with others for dialogue. I once formed a small book club, one chapter a week. Each person read and shared their own perspective on the same passage. Some felt pain, some felt anger, some felt comforted. This difference showed me that a book is not just its content, but also a mirror reflecting each person in unique ways. And don't be afraid to reread books you read 10 years ago. When reread today, they will appear in a completely new light. I once cried rereading a short story by Thach Lam, even though before it was just a dry literature lesson, because now I had experienced losses that made me understand more deeply a very short sentence. It went without looking back. Finally, if you ask me, what should I start reading now? I won't give you a list. I will only ask in return, right now, what within you needs to be understood, healed, or illuminated? Let that question lead the way. And when you find the right book, you will know, not by reason, but by a quiet feeling in your heart that you need it. Reading, ultimately, is not about enriching knowledge, but about continuously renewing the way you live. And every page of a book, if you read it truly, will be a small step in the journey of becoming a deeper human being. Chapter 6, What to Learn *. There was a time when I read a lot, learned a lot, but didn't understand what I was learning for. I was like a mountaineer in the fog, climbing and exerting myself, but seeing no peak, not even knowing if I was on the right mountain. It was at that moment that I had to stop and ask myself what I was learning and why I chose those things. You see, after knowing what to read, the next and unavoidable question is what to learn. Because reading without learning is just skimming the surface, and learning without selection easily becomes a chaotic storehouse of information, without focus, without order, without applicability. I once was such a storehouse, and I don't want anyone to lose as many years as I did realizing this. First, I must be honest, you cannot learn everything. No matter how intelligent, diligent, or long-lived you are, you still cannot encompass every field of human life. Therefore, choosing what asterisk to learn is much more important than asterisk how much asterisk to learn. I divided my learning into 3 directions. The first direction, asterisk learning to understand myself asterisk. This is the core, because if you don't understand yourself, all other knowledge is merely decoration. I started by learning basic psychology, existential philosophy, and human history. I read Descartes to understand what independent thinking is. I read Freud to see how much I am influenced by the unconscious. I read Viktor Frankl to understand how someone who survived a concentration camp could still find meaning in life. I also learned things not found in books. Sitting alone in silence, looking into my own fears, writing down questions I couldn't answer immediately. Learning to understand myself is not easy because you will have to confront the dark parts of your soul. But if you don't walk that path, you will forever live behind a mask, learning much, knowing much, but living very far from yourself. The second direction, asterisk learning to understand others and the world asterisk asterisk. I read history not to memorize dates, but to understand what humans have done to each other when bewildered, when powerful, when loving, when hateful. I studied economics, sociology, and political science, not to become an expert, but to understand why society operates the way it does, why people are divided into classes, why some live very easily while others cannot even get a full meal. I watched documentaries, listened to podcasts, read international news. I tried to open my eyes to look outward, not just around me, but to lands I had never visited. I don't want to understand the world only through the lens of textbooks. I want to touch the complexity, the injustice, and also the strange beauty that this world carries. The third direction, asterisk learning to act. This is the part that many self-learners often overlook. Learning is not just absorption, but also transformation. I learned writing skills to tell what I understood. I learned public speaking so that my ideas wouldn't die prematurely in a drawer. I learned digital tools, from researching information to presenting engaging content. I once thought that just knowing was enough, but the truth is, if you don't turn what you learn into action, that knowledge will wither. It's like knowing how to swim but never getting into the water. It's as good as not knowing. I learned to cook, to brew coffee, to garden. These seemingly small tasks helped me understand that learning doesn't have to be profound. Sometimes, learning is about making a dish for someone you love, and that is just as important as understanding Nietzsche's philosophy. What to learn for me is also linked to a principle of life. Learn what you don't know, but also relearn what you thought you knew. I once thought I understood what freedom, happiness, and morality were. Those words appeared abundantly in books, newspapers, and moving speeches. But then one day, I began to question again. Is freedom real? Am I truly happy? Is morality what we are taught? And from that moment, I relearned from scratch. I learned by looking at my choices, the conflicts between values and reality, between what I believed and what I did. I no longer learned for quick answers, but to keep the questions alive within me long enough until I could feel them in my bones, not just in my head. Beyond broad fields like philosophy, psychology, and history, I also learned many small things. I learned how to fold clothes neatly, how to fix an electrical outlet, how to clear my desk at the end of each day. Because I realized that if I couldn't do the small things well, I shouldn't hope to do the big things. I once thought great people surely didn't bother with trivial matters. But then I read in Leonardo da Vinci's diary that he once spent hours just observing how a drop of water fell onto a wooden surface. I understood that attention to small things is the foundation for all great discoveries. So I learned to sharpen a pencil, to brew tea just right, to write a sentence sincerely. I learned as if that was how I respected life itself. I also relearned my own native language. Many people learn English, French, Japanese, but forget that they have never deeply studied Vietnamese. I reread classical literary works, studied grammatical structures, etymology, the art of wordplay, because I believe that language is not just a tool, it is the way we perceive and express the world. A wrong word is a skewed thought. A sentence lacking melody is an immature idea. Whatever you learn must suit your temperament. Some people prefer to learn by listening, some need to see, some only understand when they do it themselves. I once forced myself to learn the way others excelled, then realized I was losing my unique self. Now I know, if I am a writer, I will learn by writing. If I am imaginative, I will learn by storytelling. And I respect that unique path as a solitary trail in the forest of knowledge. I also learned by letting go of unnecessary things. This world is not short of people who know too many things but can't apply any of them. I don't need to know every math formula if I don't live by math. But I need to know how to plan finances, how to read an employment contract, how to distinguish real news from fake online. I chose to learn what makes me live more steadily, understand myself better, and connect more closely with others. Someone will ask, is that enough learning? I don't know. But I do know that every single thing I learn, no matter how small, if I learn it with all my attention and respect, it becomes a part of me. And that is the only thing I need to continue. Not to become a mobile knowledge repository, but to be a person with depth, connection, and inner vitality. So if you are wondering what to learn, don't ask others. Ask your own life. What makes your heart ache? What do you do that makes you feel truly alive? What do you not yet understand but feel you must grasp? Start there, and you won't go astray. I once learned great things but lived very wearily. I also learned very mundane things but felt my heart light up like an autumn morning. From that, I understood that what you learn is not as important as how you learn, and how you learn is not as important as whether you dare to live with what you learn. Chapter 7. 3 Key Elements to Build a Solid Culture. I have spent most of my life learning, not just academic knowledge, but how to live, how to understand people, how to exist meaningfully in a volatile world. But the more I learned, the more I realized no one can learn alone. Knowledge, no matter how profound, needs a cultural soil to take root. And from that reflection, I began to ask myself, what creates a solid culture in which everyone can learn and live meaningfully? This question is not easy, but I've distilled it into 3 elements, not as formulas, but as 3 spiritual pillars: ethics, art, and science. If one of the 3 is missing, the culture will tilt and people will lose their way. I say this not from books, but from the brokenness, the anxieties, and also the moments of illumination I have experienced. The first element, ethics. I once thought ethics was something taught in schools or written in constitutions. But then I saw that true ethics lies not in teachings, but in how a person lives when no one is watching. It's when you return a long-borrowed book. It's when you quietly refrain from slandering someone behind their back. It's when you don't exploit the naivety of others for your own gain. Ethics is not a set of rules, but a sensibility, a sensitivity to right and wrong, good and evil, to the pain and joy of others. I have made mistakes, lied, been selfish. I am not a perfectly good person. But precisely because I have erred, I understand what remorse is. And from that remorse, I learned compassion. Ethics, for me, begins with humility. I have seen my society at many times in disarray, not because of a lack of laws, but because ethics are disregarded. People are good at covering up, good at embellishing, but impoverished in their understanding of the consequences of their actions. When ethics are no longer the root, everything else, even knowledge and talent, is merely a dangerous tool in the hands of those without direction. So I learn ethics not by studying moral philosophy, but by learning to be human. I read memoirs, watched biographical films, observed the elders around me, seeing how they lived, how they failed, how they forgave. I even learned from those not considered decent to know what I didn't want to become. Learning ethics, for me, is learning not to betray the human part of myself. The second element, art ***. Art is where I retreat when reason is too weary, when formulas, definitions, and arguments no longer say anything. I turn on music, read a poem, gaze at a painting. I don't seek answers, I seek quietude, and it is in that quietude that I hear my own voice. I once thought art was a luxury, that only those with leisure, money, and means could appreciate it. But then I met an old janitor who carried a small book of poetry in his pocket every afternoon. I asked, "What do you read poetry for, sir?" He said, "To feel less coarse." That answer choked me up. It turns out art is not for sophistication, but to keep the human soul from hardening in a life burdened by too many worries. It helps us not become talking, laughing, working machines that forget we can still be moved, can dream, can forgive. I learn art not to become an artist, but to become a softer person. I write letters by hand, I listen to traditional Vietnamese opera, I learn to feel the rhythm in every sentence. I even learn silence, because in art, sound is not always needed. Sometimes, it's the space between two notes that brings tears to our eyes. A culture cannot be stable if its people no longer know how to feel. A society where people only know how to scoff, be cynical, and doubt all beauty is a society bleeding out, and nothing can save it but art. The third element, and the most easily misunderstood, is science ***. When we talk about science, people often think of laboratories, formulas, data, machines. But for me, science is first and foremost a spirit. That spirit is not loud, not arrogant, not hasty. It is the patience of someone walking in the dark, groping step by step, illuminating each stone beneath their feet. Knowing they might stumble, but still going, because ahead lies something worth discovering. I was once fascinated by scientists like Newton and Darwin, not just for their achievements, but for their attitude to life. An attitude of always doubting what they knew, always ready to discard what was certain if new evidence emerged. Science, for me, is a way to keep myself humble, because it teaches that this world is much vaster than what we once believed. I learned science not to become a scientist. I learned to live with clarity, to know that not everything is true just because it's printed in a book. To understand that all truths have limits, and it is those limits that compel us to continue learning, continue correcting mistakes, continue growing. A culture based solely on faith and ethics easily falls into superstition and dogma. A culture leaning only towards art easily becomes dreamy, detached from reality. Only when science is added, with its spirit of critical inquiry, verification, and transparency, does everything balance out. And that is the culture I believe is solid, where ethics guides the heart, art nurtures the soul, and science illuminates the path. When these three elements are present and mutually supportive, humans are truly nourished from the inside out. I once lived in a society where ethics was a slogan, art was scorned, and science was distorted. I saw people there living in doubt, weariness, and disorientation, not because they were ignorant, but because they lacked access to a cultural system that nurtured humanity. I also went through periods where only one of these three elements dominated my life. At times, I lived too much by moral principles, to the point of being strict and cold even with myself. At other times, I was so immersed in art that I became detached from reality, living like a sleepwalker. And there were times I was so passionate about scientific theory that I lost connection with emotions and compassion. Only when these three elements were named, recognized, and placed correctly in my life did I find peace. Culture, after all, is not something lofty. It is the silent but firm foundation on which people can grow without feeling lost. And if I have any dream for each person's learning life, it is that you will build for yourself an inner culture, however simple, that fully embraces these three elements. Because only then will learning not just be the accumulation of knowledge, but truly a journey of becoming human. A three-room house, one room for ethics, one for art, one for science. These three rooms are not opposing, not overwhelming each other, but together they support each other, creating a space where you can learn, live, and love completely. If your life is a house, what do you want it to be built with? Chapter 8, Some Working Principles. There were times I sat for hours before a blank page, my mind paralyzed. Not because I didn't know anything, but because I didn't know where to start. The more I learned and read, the more I realized that knowledge is vast, but my time and energy are limited. Therefore, without clear working principles, I would quickly fall into a spiral of procrastination, distraction, and exhaustion. I once worked as if I were immortal, taking on task after task, constantly accepting more, not knowing how to refuse. The result was burnout, frustration, and a creeping doubt about the very things I once loved. At that point, I knew I needed to stop, to reset how I lived, learned, and worked. The first principle I set for myself and always adhere to is not starting the day by checking social media or email. It might seem trivial, but it completely transformed the quality of my mind. Before, every morning, as soon as I opened my eyes, I'd grab my phone, read news, scroll through feeds, reply to messages. Before I could even breathe, the world would bombard my mind with negative news, fleeting reactions, and emotions that weren't mine. They filled my head sometimes before I was even fully awake, and then I would step into the new day like someone being dragged along, without control, without consciousness. Since I changed that, everything else changed too. I start the morning with silence, with a few lines of handwritten journal, with a passage from an old book I love, and only after my mind has settled do I open the door to the world. The morning is the foundation of the entire day, and I want it to be built strong. The second principle, do one thing at a time. This is very difficult in an age where everything demands your attention. Your phone vibrates, notifications pop up, work interrupts. I once thought I was good at multitasking. I could read a book, reply to texts, listen to a podcast all at once. But then I realized I didn't remember anything. I wasn't truly present in any activity. I lived as if constantly running through many rooms but never staying long enough in any to see its beauty. So I practice single tasking. When I read a book, I turn off all devices. When I write, I leave my phone in another room. When I meet someone, I look into their eyes and ignore other sounds. Focus is a learner's most precious asset, and if you don't protect it, the world will take it all from you. The third principle, rest is not laziness but part of the work cycle. I used to feel guilty every time I rested, as if I was wasting time, as if success would flee if I paused for a moment. But then I realized that the best ideas, the deepest insights, came to me not when I was straining, but when I was relaxed. I walk, I make tea, I sit and watch the rain fall outside the window, and in those moments my mind is refreshed. Rest is not a meaningless void, but the fertile ground where seeds of thought quietly germinate. So I learned to rest completely, just as I learned to study seriously. The fourth principle, respect your own biological rhythm. Some people work best in the early morning, others come alive at night. I once forced myself to follow someone else's high-performance schedule and felt inadequate when I couldn't keep up. But then I realized each person is a different biological system. You can't expect all trees to bloom at the same hour. I gradually listened to my body when I was alert, when I was tired, when I needed to retreat, when I could advance, and I built my work schedule around that, instead of fighting against it. The fifth principle, do less but do it deeply. I used to have a habit of enrolling in many courses, half-reading dozens of books, starting many projects. I thought more was better. But then I looked back and realized I was just running in circles on the surface. I knew a little about many things but mastered nothing. The knowledge in me was like uncompressed sand, scattered and slipping away when needed. From then on, I changed. Each month, I chose only one topic to focus on. I read deeply, rewrote in my own words, questioned, pondered, dialogued with myself about that topic. Instead of reading 3 books superficially, I studied one book so thoroughly that I could retell it in my own voice, quote without flipping pages, and apply it to a specific decision in my life. And I found that understanding one thing deeply is more powerful than knowing 10 things superficially. The 6th principle, don't compare asterisk. Comparison is a subtle and silent trap. I used to feel inferior when I saw others learning faster, writing better, doing more. Each time I lost motivation. But gradually I understood each person has their own journey, their own pace. I don't know what they've been through, what their background is, what sacrifices they made to achieve those results. I learned to return to my internal compass, asking myself each day, am I better than I was yesterday? Is there anything I did today that made me proud? Is there anything new that made me curious? True progress is quiet progress. It doesn't need a stage, doesn't need spotlights, doesn't need to prove anything to anyone but myself. The 7th principle, write every day asterisk. Writing is how I reflect, organize, digest, and retain what I've learned. I write journals, critiques, unanswered questions. I don't write for publication but to understand myself. Some mornings I write only a short passage, some days I write 5 pages straight. Length doesn't matter. What matters is that I allow myself to think on paper so I don't carry all that chaos in my head. I maintain the habit of recording what I have read, heard, pondered. I don't quote verbatim but rewrite in my own interpretation. Because only when I write it down do I know how much I truly understand. Many times, while writing mid-sentence, I realize I haven't truly grasped what I thought I understood. And so I have to go back, dig deeper, read more carefully. Writing, for me, is an indispensable learning tool. The final principle sounds contradictory but is fundamental to all. Leave room for randomness asterisk. I plan, I discipline myself, I set goals, but I also leave a part of my day for the unexpected. An unplanned conversation, an article I stumble upon, an idea that suddenly strikes me while washing dishes. If I only work by schedule, I will miss those strange currents. And it is precisely those currents that make my learning life vibrant and soulful. Once, I was reading a thick book on Western philosophy when my eyes accidentally fell upon an ancient Eastern poem in an old magazine. These 2 seemingly distant worlds, when they met within me, sparked a chain of ideas I had never imagined. And from that, I understood. Learning, besides willpower, also needs serendipity, so I don't confine myself too tightly. I keep my mind flexible enough to welcome surprises, firm enough not to be swept away, and discerning enough to know what to hold on to and what to let go of. Each person will have their own working principles, but I believe if you can combine discipline and flexibility, focus and openness, depth and lightness, you will not only learn more but also live more fully on that learning journey. For me, these principles are not a burden, they are the framework that gives me more freedom. Like a boat that needs a sturdy hull to dance among the waves without sinking. And a life of learning, if it lacks that framework, will easily drift without ever reaching shore. There are books that, when closed, make people feel they have learned something. But there are also books, like my self-learning journey, that only truly begin to open after they are closed, opening up a quiet space, a question, a subtle scratch in how we see ourselves and the world. I don't know under what circumstances you listen to this book amidst a busy day or during a sleepless night. I don't know how much you remember of what I've told, or if anything made you pause for a few seconds to think. But if at some moment, amidst the sounds flowing into your ears, an idea gently touched your mind and made you silent, then this journey has a reason to exist. My self-learning doesn't teach you what to learn, but suggests how to re-examine how you have learned. It doesn't offer advice, but leaves the trace of someone who once sat by the window of their life, turning pages and asking themselves, can one, after all, learn to be human? This is not a philosophy, much less a formula. It is the whisper of someone who has walked through solitude, weariness, and freedom, to say that learning is a way to live more kindly with oneself. If you found something worth remembering in this book, I hope you will leave a comment, no need for explanation. Just honesty, because sometimes a remark from a listener helps the storyteller understand even more deeply what they have just told. And now, goodbye and see you again.